really honored. I wanted to thank Barbara Bradbury and the Friends of the Milford Town Library for inviting me here today to present The Hunger Saint. I have a brief presentation that I'm going to show before I read some excerpts from the book. So I wrote The Hunger Saint to help foster a larger awareness of the Carusi, the child miners of Italy. For countless generations, children, some as young as 6 years old, were sold by their impoverished families to the sulfur mines of rural Sicily in exchange for what was known as a soccorso morto, which literally translates to dead loan, because the debt was either paid off at one's death or after many years of hard labor. Over a period of 5 years, I devoted myself to the study of the Carusi, but soon realized that so little had been written about them outside of a few books and short stories written by Italian authors such as Luigi Pirandello, and a haunting collection of essays by Booker T. Washington, the American educator and author, called The Man Farthest Down. I needed to speak with those who had a closer connection to this history. In 2013, and here are some images of the Carusi, and in Italian, the word Carusi translates to boys, and they were the child miners of Sicily. And this is another image that was taken. It was taken on site in 2013, actually at a mining site called the Minerario Florestella Grotta Calda, which is located in the region of Enna, near the town of Vogonera Caro Pepi, where I did a lot of my research. And in 2013, I was extremely fortunate to have the opportunity to travel to this part of Sicily. And in the Parco Minerario Florestella Grotta Calda, this open-air museum was once the site of the largest sulfur mine in Sicily. And it was through the generosity of this museum that I was able to conduct the research that allowed me to write this book. I was very fortunate to visit other mining sites during this time and also other smaller museums that were devoted to this labor history, while conducting a series of oral histories among the surviving miners who lived in the area. One man I spoke with, Andrea Alberti, was 103 years old at the time of our interview. He had started his working life as a Caruso, and he could remember Mussolini visiting the mine where he worked. The miners, this is another miner that I had the privilege to speak with. He was a little bit older when he began working in the mines. But what was something that was very interesting when I had the incredible fortune to speak with these men and their families and their wives and some of their children, was even though they were able to acknowledge the tragic history of the Carusi, they were also very proud of the mining heritage, and this was a real community for these towns in this area. And this man here, he's holding up what is a lumera, a lamp that the sulfur miners used during Roman times. Gives you a little sense of just how far back the practice of the mines went, right up into the 1980s in Italy. Listening to the stories of these miners largely informed the shape and the context of the Hunger Saint. Some museums I visited, including Il Museo Lego Zolfati in the neighboring town of Piazza Amarina, showcased poetry written by various miners and Carusi, some of whom were literate. These simple but very powerful poems offered some very painful insight into the lives of those bound to a life inside of the mines. Images of reaching the ocean or flying off into the wide blue sky appeared again and again. There was a longing expressed in these poems, one that could not be broken by hard labor or abuse, one that really communicated the humanity of these people, of these young boys and these men. As a storyteller, I decided to tell the story of the Carusi through the experiences of a 12-year-old boy named Natoni. And the Hunger Saint takes place right after World War II has ended in Italy in 1948. And I will now read two excerpts from the Hunger Saint. On these stairs, shown here in this slide, is where Natoni's story begins. The miners draped a soiled loincloth over the face of old Mishu and continued to work. No one was allowed to move the body until the shift's end. Natoni adjusted the heavy basket of ore between his shoulder blades as he passed Mishu's pit. If he peered close enough inside, he could make out the figure half concealed in the shadows. Others appeared indifferent as they clawed at the subterranean walls with their mattocks and picks. An unending clink and scrape echoed through the tunnels. Natoni moved ahead, eager to return outside where the air was breathable, not thick with heat and dust. He crouched beneath low ceilings, once more imagining purgatory. Perhaps Mishu's ghost had gone the same way as Natoni's father, trapped in the farthest reaches of the mine. Tonight, he tried to discover them both. He took his place in line with the other boys, who climbed a long staircase of earthen steps, formed in zigzags to help balance the shouldered weight. An arched doorway stood at the top, emitting bright outside light. From there, they'd transport the minerals to the calcoroni, the fat stone furnaces where the sulfur rocks were melted and refined. Underground, the stairs felt cool beneath his feet. His soles were thick and crusted over with dirt, numb to the pebbles and hard rocks that once pinched and scraped him. He bent his head further to accommodate the ore basket between his shoulders. Its weight bowed him over, forcing his neck into a slight twist. There was no getting used to it, even after a month of transporting countless loads. His slow, dragging steps failed to match the steady, dogged pace of the other boys. Together on the stairs, they formed a slow-moving cloud of shared, fleeting intimacies, the pungent whiff of body odors, the grunts and moans that escaped their lips between bits of passing conversation. Everyone had something to say about Mishu. Rumor was that he'd spent his entire life underground with no family in town to visit each Sunday when the miners were allowed a day off. It was bound to happen here. How long would it take to remove the body? Mishu's soul hung in purgatory like Natoni's father. Perhaps Saint Colodoro might give some sign on his behalf too. Natoni imagined Mishu's ghost watching from the mine's ceiling, still trapped in his pit beneath the earth. Priests never visited the miners to administer last rites. The men worked too deep underground, some as far as 600 feet, where the tunnels became hot like ovens, forcing them to wear loincloths and thin caps made of linen and soft canvas. Some wore nothing at all. Another boy pushed Natoni from behind. "Wake up, Patsu, you're too slow," he said. Crazy was the name they'd given him. Natoni had made the mistake of praying aloud, muttering to himself like the broken drifters who passed through his hometown of Roccolto begging, displaced by the war. Someone might tear up his St. Calogero prayer card for fun. The others worked with better efficiency. Why couldn't he be more like them? He tried to move faster. Malpelo marched ahead of him in line, imitating Mishu's choking. He said. Everyone tried to listen. He was a bit older than the other Carusi and knew of grisu poisoning when he heard one. If the gas seeped into Mishu's pit, tainting the air around him, then it was possible that the rest of the mine was not only contaminated, but on the verge of an explosion. It didn't take much to ignite fire damp. Even smoking underground was forbidden. Still, someone would have to test Mishu's pit to be sure, Malpelo explained. There was no doctor on site to examine the body, no way to sense the gas until it was too late. Perhaps they were already inhaling fresh poison. Natoni's lungs ached as he tried not to breathe. This is later on in the book. One afternoon, as Natoni crawled beneath the low rock ceiling of a narrow tunnel underground, dragging along a basket of tools, mice began to charge at him. Dozens scurried past his hands and limbs, rushing out from the mine with frantic squeaks. The creatures forced him still. An endless pinch of tiny clawed feet scrambled over his skin. Then the earthen floor turned, a slow, gradual spin. The surrounding walls trembled. Black, crooked mouths of nearby caves and tunnels yawned, their shadows elongating across the dim corridors. Natoni threw down his basket. Gripping an acetone lamp, he scrambled back through the tunnels. He approached the first miner he could. The man stood, burrowing a rock drill into the wall, absorbed in his work. "Did you feel that?" Natoni shouted over the machine's buzz. The miner glared, but soon felt the dizzy sway of the walls surrounding his own pit. A low rumbling emitted from the rocks. He shut off the drill and cast a long gaze over the ceiling above. Dust sprinkled out from along a crack. His eyes bulged. He grabbed his lamp and raced out, screaming, "Cave in! Cave in!" Already a thunderous roar approached, much like the growl of an ore cart in the near distance. Mice continued to race past their feet. Natoni hurried after the miner, shouting, alerting the others, and a small crowd of workers soon joined them. They funneled into the main artery of the mine, everyone talking at once. Lamplight appeared and disappeared in sporadic bursts, a disjointed maze of shadow and panic. Frantic lines of Carusi hurried up along the tall stairway to the glowing archway at the top of the steps. Several bodies tumbled over one another. Natoni searched past everyone, frantic for his brother Lido. He raced closer toward the stairway. A ferocious groan echoed through the tunnels, and the walls twitched and crumbled. Soon the roof would give. Natoni only caught a glimpse of the stairway's collapse, the fallen boys crushed. He screamed for Lido. A wave of dust and rubble kicked up and rushed forward. Natoni raced back through the tunnels, colliding with others. A thick dust cloud overwhelmed the area, knocking out the acetone lamps and submerging them all into darkness. The men screamed. They tore at one another in a sightless fury. Cords of anguish rose and fell, splintered among long, hacking coughs. An explosion sounded in the distance, then another. The air was on fire, full of burning dirt and smoke. Natoni's eyes singed. A rain of hard pellets darted against his body, followed by a large rock that struck him against the jaw. Blood soaked through his tongue. A dim flickering emerged ahead, revealing the outline of a shaft, a wide rectangular box, the elevator. Uneven shards of daylight emerged through its steel cage doors. Heat and dust shimmered in the small visible spaces above their heads. Some of the men fell against the elevator and tried to pull its doors apart, desperate to climb up the cables or find some refuge inside. Some pressed their faces against the meshing and screamed for help, hoping their cries would be lifted up through the shaft. The rumbling stopped. One of the miners found a lamp hanging near the elevator and revealed a wall of rocks that blocked the passage from where they'd come, though another tunnel remained open nearby. Natoni knew that this one emptied out into the pit of Scavelli, the miner he once assisted. He remembered the ladder that led above ground through the ventilation shaft. Natoni pushed past the others who told him to stay put. It might take hours, if not days, for someone to dig them out. There was no telling when or if another cave-in would erupt. Natoni pushed past them and squeezed back through the tunnels, shoving himself forward in the darkness. Others trailed close behind, doubtful of rescue. He rounded another corner where a pair of eyes shot out from the weak lamplight. Natoni jumped back. Scavelli's face emerged from the shadows, covered in soot and blood. "What are you still doing here?" "Where's Lido?" The miner struggled for breath as he limped forward. He already took his basket upstairs, outside to the furnaces. Natoni turned, but Scavelli caught him by the arm. "Don't you smell the poisoned air, the fire nearby? These tunnels could explode. Get back to the elevator." "I need to find my brother." "He's not here. He must have made it out. Go back." "It's not running. The elevator's not running. There's only the ventilator shaft." Scavelli's gaze trained on him for a moment before he handed over the lamp. He followed Natoni at a hobbled gait. Blood covered his thighs. Soon they reached the wide mouth of the ventilation shaft, its rope ladder still intact. Other miners joined them. "That's a 200-foot climb," Scavelli said. Natoni gripped its rungs and pulled himself up into the chute. The rope felt too thin and flimsy. Another tremor shook the walls. Rocks fell back around them, but they pulled themselves through the shaft, a compressed space maybe 2 feet wide, barely enough for the men to fit. They squeezed themselves up. Natoni climbed, forcing himself along each desperate inch of braided leather and twine that wore on and chafed against his raw palms. If he slipped, his fall would topple those beneath him. Perhaps the rope would give out, snapping under their weight. The climb felt endless. Natoni's muscles burned, his movement slowed. The dizziness returned. His grip loosened with each rung. Then the rope tugged with such violence that Natoni shrieked and wrapped himself around the thin ladder as he waited for the rope to snap. The men began to scream. Natoni cut his eyes to Scavelli, whose legs worked in savage thrusts, kicking at the hands and faces of those behind him, forcing the men to drop, their cries echoing down the long metal tunnel. Then he turned and reached for Natoni. Thank you, everybody.
Oh my God, that's good. Wow. Wow.
So I'm happy to take any questions. I'm also happy to sign copies. We have some copies of The Hunger Saint for sale for $12, but I'm going to open it up for questions first, if anyone Yes.
How did these children so the parents owed money to someone and the children had to pay off the debt? Is that
Yes.
how they came to be slaves in this mine, basically?
It was the Soccorso Morto system. My understanding of it is it was very similar to the system of indentured servitude, where you were given a loan in advance on the promise of the services that you would give. And so it might take you 10 years to essentially work off the loan. And the loan was given per child or per, the head of the household to support the family. And most people, once they were in the mines, and if they survived, once the Soccorso Morto was paid off, they stayed and they worked in the mines for the rest of their lives. Because it was also a culture of mining where you were a miner, your brothers were miners, your great-grandfather, your father. I mean, it was like a family. It was like that was what the town was connected. And so it was at equal parts. There was a lot of pride and culture and community, but it was also, there were no unions. There was no safeguards by the government to protect people and their families. So unfortunately, you did have people, children especially, who were exploited and abused, and it was a very brutal system.
By the mafia?
Well,
were the people running it?
There were.
Mafia.
My understanding is that there definitely were mafia involved. Originally, before Sicily became part of Italy, it was owned by British companies, the mines themselves, and there was also Sicilian families who were, you were either a landowner or you worked the land, and that was the same with the mining tradition. You owned the mines and your family, or you worked, and it was it was a very brutal system for those who were poor and lived under this system.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, at Suffolk, what do you teach?
At Suffolk University, I'm very privileged to teach writing. I teach various levels of writing. I teach academic writing. I've taught creative writing. So I teach all different varieties.
And when did you, I could just tell from your reading, the vocabulary and the flow is beautiful.
Thank you.
Go back to when you said that what first interested you, and I just never knew this existed. I didn't even know about sulfur mines in Sicily. What inspired you to investigate this?
Well, I never heard about this either, and I'm a third generation Italian American. My family is originally from Sicily, but we didn't work none of my relatives, to the best of my knowledge, ever worked in the mines themselves. They were fishermen. But I was very interested in my 20s, my early to mid 20s. I really wanted to learn more about my family's culture. And so I was living in New York City in the time, and was very fortunate that there was a Sicilian language class being offered. And so I took the class. I was very interested in learning more about the language and the dialect, the Sicilian dialect. And some people think the Sicilian dialect is its own language. And I was also very interested in learning about Sicilian culture and heritage, because I didn't know a lot about it outside of American movies, The Godfather, The Sopranos, And it was in this language class that I learned about the Carusi, and I was horrified, and that's what set me on this journey to learn more, until I was finally fortunate enough to take this trip some years back, and that was what allowed me to do this more intensive research.
I was going to ask you about the dialect. When you interviewed these people, I'm sure 103-year-old guy only spoke dialect, and it's extremely difficult to understand. Everything ends in U.
Absolutely. Yep.
Did you have another Sicilian to help translate what these people were saying?
I did.
The course you took, but I know wouldn't be sufficient to follow these old geezers and their stories.
Well, what's really fascinating, I'm so glad you brought that up about the Sicilian dialect, because the dialect changes with every Sicilian town you go to. It changes a little bit. And it's really, the language really becomes a code among the people. And now it's, sadly, it's only the older generation that really know the language, and the younger generations, it's dying out, which is very sad. They speak more mainstream Italian. And so the course I took was definitely an introduction. The town of Volgonera Caropepi and Piazza Armerino, that was where I did most of the oral histories. I was very fortunate that I have a colleague, she's from Volgonera Caropepi, and I didn't know this until I was putting my research together, and then I was reaching out to Italian intellectuals and people, academics I knew, and writers for support, because I didn't really know where to begin in terms of this kind of research. And you know, my training has been as a writer, as a storyteller, as a fiction writer, but I'm very passionate about historical research, and I think it's incredibly valuable to give stories a real heightened sense of life and reality, and especially for this history that I wanted to connect people to. So Chiara Mazzucchelli, who was the woman from Volgonera Caropepi, she's an academic. She teaches at the University of Central Florida, and I knew her through other colleagues. So she actually translated some of the oral histories. So she helped me a lot in that respect. But I also had help when I was there. I had people who were helping me translate. So I was very lucky. I was able to reach out into my networks, and I was able to help. People were able to kind of step in and support me in that way.
Okay.
Now, when you have the island of Sicily,
Yeah.
I'm trying to visualize it. So we have Palermo up here,
Mm-hmm.
then we go down, I'm going to say Agrigento, because
Mhm.
all right. Then you go up and then to Trapani. So I just know like Syracuse,
Yeah.
Nancy, some of the more popular, but just where was this located?
So
On the map.
yeah, no, I'm really glad you asked. So Volgonera Caropepi and Piazza Armerina are located in the province of Enna, and it's right in the middle of the island. And Enna is actually the capital of that province, you know. So it's right in the heart of the island. And you really need, I mean, there are buses that it takes about 30 to 40 minutes. You can take a bus from Catania to Enna, or even to these smaller towns. They do have a good bus system. You know, sometimes the schedules can be a little confusing, but it's really right in the middle of the island. Yeah, it's more mountainy area where you had all these veins of mines, right, with these precious minerals like sulfur. And sulfur, you know, Sicily was at one point the world's leading sulfur producer, and sulfur was used, now it's used more for medicinal purposes, and it's, you know, it was back then, but it was used for a lot of, you know, ammunition, and it was used as an energy resource for war and for other, you know, certainly, you know, Mussolini and other, you know, they used that as a resource. And then sulfur was, in the late 1800s, was discovered in Texas, actually, in the United States, and then the United States became the world leader in sulfur production. But the mines themselves were a very profitable industry for Italy, and then in the 1940s and the 50s and 60s, that's when you had a lot more better enforcement of labor laws and children's rights, and then the industry really began to decline, and it ended in the 1980s. But you had mines, small mines, all over the island at one point. Yes.
I'm embarrassed to say this
Yeah.
because before you started talked about sulfur itself and its uses, the only connection I have with sulfur is on a molasses bottle.
Uh-huh.
So sulfur is a mineral, it's like a vitamin that you can take, but then
Yeah.
it's used in artillery?
Yeah, it was
Can you explain that?
it was a major energy resource. What they would do is they would mine raw chunks of sulfur ore from the earth, and they would bring it to the furnaces to above, above the mines. And these small boys, the Carusi, before they had better technology, the children would actually carry the raw minerals on their backs in these baskets, because the idea was the boys were small enough to travel through the tunnels. And sometimes they'd even bring donkey carts and whatnot down to reach these veins of precious minerals. And then they'd bring the minerals up and they'd melt them down into pure sulfur. So they'd deliver the sulfur in these blocks. It was like they were like blocks of gold. That's what the Italian translates to. And they would sell, and you could burn them. You could use them for energy. They were an energy
Burn them for heat?
For heat. It was I think my understanding is that it was used mostly for like ammunition and for weapons and whatnot. But they have sulfur baths, like thermal baths now, that are active. You can go and, it doesn't smell very pleasant, but you can go and, it's supposed to do wonders for your skin. But actually breathing in, for the miners themselves, they actually got something that was very, with the coal miners here in the States, we heard a lot about like black lung disease. And they actually had something very similar to that among Sicilian miners, where they would be breathing in these minerals, and the minerals would, it would actually like mineralize the lungs. It would harden the lungs, and it was very terrible. People would get lung infections, and it really shortened their lifespans.
What does sulfur look like when you go to mine?
It's yellow, so it's kind of like a egg yolky yellow, bright yellow, and it was like actually someone gave me a little raw. I wish I had brought it in, but it's like white. It looks like white and yellow crystals, and they have to purify it in order to sell it. So you'll see like streaks of sulfur along the insides of the mines. And it's really beautiful, but then they have to take that and melt it down. Sometimes it has like a chalky feeling to it. But it's like an egg, it's like a yellow egg-like yellow.
How many centuries does this go back to mine?
It's, it goes back, probably even the ancient Greeks, even before, pre-Roman times. And the interesting thing, when I was there, they would actually build on the old mines, because that's where the veins of mineral were that they were going to dig out and to use that resource. But the mines were built on top of each other, and sometimes this was very dangerous too, because when I was in the Parco Minerario open air museum, there were certain areas you couldn't walk on because it was so unstable. You could just fall right through the earth, and it was these like sinkholes. It's kind of terrifying, but they didn't let people go down into the mines because they were too afraid they wouldn't be able to get you out.
So these people that settled in Sicily, Italians, they would probably had ancestors from Africa?
I don't know. Sicily has been colonized, and there's been so many peoples that have come through Sicily since ancient times. It's from the ancient Normans, the French Normans, to the Greeks. It was a Greek colony. It was an Athenian colony at one point in ancient Greek times, and then it was part of the Roman Empire, and then it was, you had the Moors, and you had the Spaniards, and it's just been during the Crusades, actually, Sicily was one of the few places that was not at war. Even though you had all these religious wars going on, it was a place of a lot of trade and multiculturalism and a lot of diversity, and it was thought of as the breadbasket of the world at one point. So Sicily, it's hard to, because when you go to Sicily, you'll see people of so many different, you'll see Sicilians of so many different backgrounds, some blonde-eyed, blue-eyed people who look like they're maybe they came from some part of France, or people who look from maybe ancient Persian. It's really a fascinating place, and you can see that diversity and that richness reflected in the history and also the architecture and the foods. I think that's one of the things I love about Sicily, and why I chose to write about it, is that whenever you go or you read about it, there's always something new to explore and to learn about it.
I have family from Nebraska,
Oh, yeah.
a cousin, and until a few years ago, I wasn't aware of it. They go on trips, and for some reason, they decided to go to Italy many, many years ago. And they go back all the time. They seem to center more upon the Lake District area. They did go to Greece last summer, but they went right back to Italy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so
They've
many.
been all over Italy.
That's wonderful.
They're not Italian.
Well, I
They
think
love Italy.
it's really fascinating. I mean, I think there's so much about Italian culture that is so interesting for anyone from any walk of life. I mean, whether you're interested in art or history, or I'm very passionate about labor issues and child labor issues in particular. And so and unfortunately, the history of the Carusi is something that is a timeless issue. That the conditions that these children endured and suffered through are things that are happening all over the world today, in the Congo, in the cobalt mines, and in the salt mines, and different parts of Southeast Asia, Indonesia. So it's a sad reality, but I believe that literature and the arts can bring people together and help foster compassion and awareness, and that's why I wrote the book. So.
Now, the gentleman you interviewed that's 103 years old, I'm amazed that you were able to interview someone who worked in those mines because of the health issues.
Yeah.
How did he manage to live that long?
I think his life was a miracle that I was able to speak with him, and I was able to meet him because of the people that I knew. There was a man who was the director of his name was Dr. Salvatore De Vita, and he was very connected to this mining community. And this man, he was actually in a nursing home, and we were able to, but he wanted to speak with us. And so he had some stories that he was still very lucid, he was very lucid enough to communicate to us. And it was just incredible hearing what he could remember. And it is really fascinating, because I think that as the technology improved, of course, one's ability to survive the mines greatly improved as well. But I think a lot of the miners, they always knew once they went to work every day that could be their last day on Earth, because there were so many hazards. From cave-ins to health hazards, like not knowing that you were exposed to poisonous gas, or developing chronic health conditions such as lung ailments. A lot of the Carusi and the miners themselves, because they were crawling through the tunnels, their bodies themselves became hunched and deformed. And Luigi Pirandello, the famous Italian author, has a beautiful short story. I think it's called Cielo Discovers the Moon. And I may be pronouncing the name, but that's the name of the story. And it's this beautiful story, but you get a real sense of the physical hardships that this boy who had spent his whole life working underground had never been to the surface where he could see them. He had never been above surface at night. He had always been working during the nights in the mines, and it's so a lot of the people they suffered. They were dwarfed. They had severe contortions with their bodies because of the hazards. But I think that that did change the longer people worked in the mines, you know, as the technology, and actually what happened is a lot of the smaller mines closed and the mines continued to consolidate. So when you really only had the Parco Minerario Flores della Grotta Calda at the end, that was one of the last mines that stayed open until the 1980s. And that mine had much better conditions where people were not enduring these issues. So I can't tell how did this man survive so much, but people survived, as hard as it was, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you.
Well,
Oh,
Thank
one
you.
more question.
Of course.
What did they eat?
That's a good.
About that.
So it's interesting. One of the things they would bring down is these preserved. They would take this meat. They're called Muffaletta Sandwiches, and it was these sandwiches with these preserved meat that they would cure with salt, and so and they would bring that down into the mines, and they would eat that. And you know, of course, wherever there's people, there are mice, you know, and little varmints and things too. But the Muffaletta sandwiches and that preserved meat was something. And so this is actually a really quick story. I was very privileged. I was very fortunate to go on a small book tour for this book across the United States. And one of the places I was very privileged to visit was West Virginia. And I did not know that in West Virginia, they have a sizable Italian-American population there. And it was because a lot of Italians who came to the United States, who immigrated here looking for a better life, they went to places where they could practice their trades. And so a lot of Italians ended up in West Virginia because they had known mining. So even though they were now coal miners, they were, you know, they had known mining as sulfur miners or salt miners in Italy. And so then you had these big populations of Italians coming to different parts of West Virginia and working in the coal mines because that was how they knew how to support their families. And in West Virginia, they have something called the pepperoni roll, which is similar to a muffaletta sandwich, where you bake pepperoni into these rolls, and that's what the coal miners would take down and the West Virginia coal miners would take because it would stay preserved. It's just fascinating, all these little connections, and you link it back to these ethnic origins, places like Italy and Sicily.
Are you from Milford? Where are you
Oh, I'm from the Boston area. I'm originally from Peabody, but
Oh, so you're aware that this town at one time had quarries, and there were a lot of immigrants from Italy that worked in the quarries?
yeah, it's incredible.
Yeah.
I was hoping, you know, if folks had connections themselves and their families with miners. You know, it's interesting how you put a book into the world and you never know how it's going to affect people. And there are certain things that are timeless, like the mining industry, and how certain conditions and concerns are just relevant all throughout that industry, or any industry, I think, any labor-intensive industry. Yeah.
So in Italy, where people worked in quarries, you
Yeah.
know, getting granite and all that, were they working under conditions like this also, or was that altogether different? Or do you know?
Well, I think that unfortunately child labor was always a condition in poor Italian families, right? I mean, your father had a trade and that was your option, right? It was very hard to have other opportunities because work is still in Italy today, it's southern Italy today, it's still very difficult to come by regular good paying employment. And so people especially back, before child labor laws were really enforced, they did enforce child labor laws in the early 1900s. I think it was like in written down right here, 1886. That was the first time where the Italian government released legislation in 1886 that prohibited children from working, I think it was like children under the age of 9, from working in quarries and mines and doing hard labor, because that was, if you were able and old enough to help your father, your grandfather, to help go out and support your family, you did it. And there was a sense of pride there. There was also a lot of brutal conditions that children and their families were exposed to that they didn't really have a lot of legal protection. There was, like I said earlier, there was no unions, and the government, didn't have any they didn't have any legislation in place. Now, even though this was passed in 1886, it wasn't really enforced, and so for a long time, in rural places like Sicily, where people were very impoverished, they had large families, and not a lot of regulation by the government or a union or whatnot. So it was shocking that when I heard about this, it was hard for me to believe at first until I started to talk to people and do more research. And but by the 1950s, 1960s, that's when there was a lot of reform and more child protective, even women's rights. These are things that really in Italy started to become taken more seriously.
So now you say that there are a lot of mines in Texas, in this country. Is that what you were saying?
Well, it was just an interesting tidbit I learned was that Sicily was the leading sulfur mining producer for many, many, many years, until sulfur was discovered in Texas, which is interesting to me because I don't associate it with Texas with sulfur, but it was, and that the United States actually became the leading sulfur producer after that. This was like in the 1800s, 1900s, and that was something that contributed to the decline of the sulfur mining industry in Italy.
So my question is, in Texas, do they have immigrants from Central America working? Are the conditions greatly improved?
I honestly don't know in terms of like the mining or in terms of like agricultural needs. From what I have read, I'm sure those people suffer a great deal, and it's heartbreaking. I don't know. I wouldn't have that information. In terms of like when you're talking about mining conditions today in Texas, I unfortunately don't know.
If you were, even in Milford, if you were Sicilian, you were looked down upon by the northern Italians, those who came from, let's say, Lombardia, or we see it, we saw it. They just did not know and appreciate the history, as you said, of Sicily, the Moors, the French, the House of Savoy. You're way, way up north, and you're the king of Savoy, and your kingdom is Sicily. And you don't even visit it, but you rape it. You take everything that they grow, the wheat, the fruit, the vegetables, that all goes to the mainland. And even those people that lived on the boot, even the Macajans, we could go on and on, they always look down on the Sicilians.
Yeah.
And it's changed. It's changed because through travel, through education, through intermarriage. But I know that. Thank you. I know that when we lived in Bologna, if you came from Naples and down, the Bolognese looked down on you. Right? But also, if you go to Milan, the Milanese, think they are more superior to, the stepping stones. So
I actually think that-
racism is alive and well still.
Unfortunately, yeah, I agree with you, and I have met some Italians that they think, oh, all Sicilians are thieves, or they don't pay their taxes, or they're all mafia, and these were Italians. I mean, these were
Yes.
people who vacationed in Sicily, because Sicily is a very popular destination spot during August, on August 15th, when you have the Dia della Madonna, and the Festa della Madonna, right, and everybody's at the beach. They go to Sicily and they enjoy the beauty, and I think that historically a lot of Italian Americans who came to this country came to the United States were immigrants who from mostly poor parts, southern parts of Italy and Sicily.
Yeah.
And these were people who were desperate to have a better life. There were no jobs, they were struggling with poverty, they couldn't feed their families, there was no opportunities. And they came here as any human being who immigrates to this country, comes here. They wanted a better life. And I think that the lack of education and a reflection of the socioeconomic realities and that they endured, but I think it unfairly set them up for resentment and discrimination by other Italians and by other people who look down at them for that. It's very sad and unfortunate, but I feel like with awareness and with compassion, we can choose not to do that to other people.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
No,
Unless there were
that's okay.
more
It's
people.
interesting.
No.
I'm so grateful that you're here
Oh, no.
and your
no,
wonderful
this is-
questions. So it's an honor for me.
Well, Olivia, this is not representative. Usually,
Usually there's lots of.
there were a lot of people. I just, was it advertised enough? Was it in the paper?
It was in the papers, it was on Facebook. it was-
Yeah, 'cause I just think the way you articulate,
Interesting.
it's fascinating.
Thank you.
Really.
Thank you.
More people should know about things like this.
Thank you. Well,
Especially
how,
if you're Italian and you've got
We appreciate it.
Italian Americans, that you've got this in your background, not necessarily, okay, so my grandfather and grandmother were from San Donato, Italy, so that's in the northern part, and I'm sure this wasn't something that they were involved in, but it's part of your history, you're Italian by lineage. My grandmother, her side, they were also from someplace in Italy. So I'm basically 100% Italian.
oh,
So that's why I'm part of the Friends. But I was also interested because it has something to do with Italy.
yeah. I think all different aspects of Italian culture should be represented. I mean, there's so much to love about Italian culture, the food, the beauty, the travel, there's so much. But I think it's important to also have exposure to more nuanced, more complicated aspects of the history. And I know that, you're here as your book lovers, and it's Elena Ferrante, I think, has done a great job of bringing up women's rights and issues with relationships, and other Italians. I think things are changing, but I agree. It's about literature and the arts. We can connect all people to more nuanced parts of a culture.
And even northern Italy, where the Germanic and even the French, on the French side, the Medici's going on, what was it, the woman, didn't she go to France?
Yeah,
I
she
don't know,
was-
Lorenzo's
she was
wife,
queen.
I don't know
Yeah.
which
She was
Medici
queen
it
of
was.
France.
Catherine.
But,
Yeah.
Catherine,
Yeah.
but then you get up to Belzano, and there's also the Swiss
Austria,
influence.
Austria,
Yeah.
Austria.
I never saw so many redheads, because we stereotype.
Yeah.
I'm talking about where we were in Bologna. Red's hot and the blondes, Whereas the Sicilians, I don't know if it was their diet, it's an island, they're short in stature. I mean, I'm talking about when we were there 50 years ago. But dark skin, just, they look different from the northern Italians. There's just so much to learn.
You know, we have more in common than you think. Even if, I'm not Italian, but, you know, I've
You just wish you were.
my husband was Jewish. All he ever ate was Italian food. He just loved Italian food. And I've often thought about when the Romans conquered England. You know, I'm English. Maybe I am part of Italian.
Yeah, it's, I mean, I think this is, we were talking about genealogy and how incredible, the more you learn, you go back and back and back, and it's haunting, actually, like the stories that you learn. And I think what's scary is, you know, we can't forget our history. However we learn and keep connected to history, whether it's through genealogy or books or art, because I think that keeps us human, and it keeps us understanding that we're part of something much greater.
Yeah. Exactly. Beautiful.
I think you had.
Well, I don't know, this isn't off the cuff. Do you happen to know Michelangelo La Luna from University of Rhode Island?
I don't.
He teaches Italian history, and he does trips every year to Calabria. for
Wonderful. Calabria is
6
beautiful.
Yes, and I did one once.
Oh,
with
that's
another
lovely.
professor.
Good for you.
And we spent 6 to 8 weeks traveling. We didn't get to Sicily, we had thought about it, but all down, and food and the language and cooking lessons, and it was amazing.
That's wonderful.
Yes, it was amazing. And I think he had the female you're talking about, Ferranti.
Oh, Elena
I
Ferranti.
think she came to the university.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, he's pretty well connected in Calabria.
That's incredible. Oh, I believe that's, wow.
Yeah, it was pretty cool.
That's
You know, I do
wonderful.
have two friends, they're sisters, they're Italian, and one visits Italy rather frequently, every like 3 years or so. And lately, the trip she's been going on, she is going down on the Mediterranean, down the bottom of the boot. Boot. And, oh, I'm having a senior moment. She now goes on these trips with cooking classes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, lucky her.
yeah.
Mangia bene.
The food out of this world. Never have I had.
Yeah,
But
seasonal.
the tomatoes, everything. But anyway, Italy is beautiful, and this is interesting.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Next trip.
Thank you so much.
We're treated,
you.
we're treated.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I guess maybe we'll put the lights off
Yeah.
and I'll
You want
sit.
to get a book there, please?
Oh, yeah.
Get a book?